and then Nadine. So we're getting 2 econometric modeling papers, so this should be really cool. That's why to start. And I will signal when you have 5 minutes left.
When I have 10 and 5.
Okay. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I'm going to talk about the exchange rate pass-through, asymmetrical empirical evidence, oh no, not this one, excuse me. No. No. Sorry?
Am I ignoring you?
Yeah.
Is your application being ignored?
No, sir. You get no, sir.
I will ignore you then.
No, sir. Don't sir.
I just asked the question.
When you ask the question,
What I'm going to talk about is Taylor principle versus exchange rate principle, empirical evidence on effectiveness in developing countries. Now, this paper deals with one of the pioneering macroeconomic policy problems which emerged after the Second World War and is still a hot topic in the profession. Although its solution to the policy problems it seeks to redress still continues to be a moot point. It is about a relevant and insightful macroeconomic and monetary economic policy principle developed by John Taylor of Stanford University, which has received some flack after the 2007 financial crisis and its aftermath. It led to the launching of quantitative easing, forward guidance, and commitment to future actions, among others, in 2008, to deal with the emergence of the zero lower bound on interest rate over the long run, a problem which is akin to what Keynes termed as a liquidity preference in his general theory in 1936. Now, I will place my modified empirical findings in the context of developing countries. Excuse me. In the context of developing countries. This is the background of the paper. I'll look at the Phillips curve, the Taylor's rule, Taylor's principle, Hessian rate principle. The Hessian rate principle is my proposition. Taylor does not deal with Hessian rate principle. It deals with the effect of interest rates on money. And here, Hessian rate principle is the effect of Hessian rate on inflation. Then I will present empirical evidence of some of the countries in the region, one country in Africa and the US, and use that as a basis of confirming that the Hessian rate principle is more effective means of handling inflation in handling inflation in general than the Taylor's principle. Then I will conclude. Now the Phillips curve, as we see it, is equation number 2 and number 1. It was developed by Alban William Housego Phillips in 1958, the year he published the Phillips curve, and that same year was the year that he became a professor at London School of Economics. And basically what he tried to do is to find a relationship between the tightness in the labor market and the real wages. And his contention is that when the labor market is slack, wages tend to drop, and if it is tight, wages tend to increase. That paper became an insightful paper, and it was used by most economists. But Phelps in 1967 and Milton Friedman in 1968, they criticized the Phillips curve that you see there. In fact, the Phillips curve that you see here is an abbreviation of what Phillips did. There are other variables, but because unemployment was the major issue and there is a significance between unemployment or the labor market and wages, most policymakers, especially macroeconomic policymakers, decided to dwell on that. Now, according to Friedman and Phelps, they argue that people are interested in real wages. They are not interested in nominal wages. If people are interested in real wages, then you cannot use nominal wages and express it as a function of the size of unemployment to make the policy argument that people were doing. So what basically they did is, if we correct for the nominal wages here, then in this case you will have this as real wages. So the real wages is basically the nominal wages minus expected inflation. And that should be what you should consider in relation to the tightness of the labor market. So that is what he did. Now, if we express this and then we bring the expected inflation to the right-hand side, then we get what is referred to as the expectation augmented Phillips curve. But this expectation augmented Phillips curve does not have a relationship between inflation and unemployment. And it was argued by Paul Samuelson that inflation is very tight with wages, in the sense that when wages increase, when there is increase in inflation, people tend to demand higher wages. If that is the case, then you could use the inflation rate as a substitute for the wage rate. And if you do that, then here you get inflation rate and unemployment. And we know that inflation is a target, monetary policy target. There are 6 monetary policy targets, but the prominent among those targets is inflation rate. So if you use that, then you get a very neat model that will now relate unemployment to inflation. So here, if we do that, and we express, instead of using a general function, if we express this function as equation 5, then you will see that here we have a relationship between inflation and expected inflation and a function of unemployment. This function here, the unemployment here is the actual unemployment, and the U superscript N is the natural rate of unemployment, which is an unemployment rate which is natural to an economy. Economy is full employment. Now, if you relate this to Okun's law, if you relate it to Okun's law, what will ensue will be an aggregate supply curve. And the Okun's law here, this here is basically the output, the unemployment gap. And this unemployment gap, you can relate it to the output gap, and the relationship will be negative relationship. If you use those negative relationships, notice that here, and you substitute it here, the output gap now, you get an augmented expectation augmented for the curve, but it's now in terms of output and natural rate of output. And in this particular context, it's become an upward slope. So if you have aggregate demand, then you can use this as the aggregate supply curve. And macroeconomics, that is what is now used. If you express this output gap, this output gap here, because it became a policy tool, most economists were using it, but Taylor used a rule. And Taylor's rule was to assist policymakers to set a targeted interest rate that will address inflation gap and output gap. Now, you should note that if you use this, this is the targeted inflation rate, this is the actual inflation rate, and this is the natural rate of output, and this is the actual output. So if there is increase in actual output, all other things being equal, you will see that it will translate into an increase in the targeted interest rate. The same way, if actual inflation is higher than the targeted inflation, then the targeted interest rate will be higher, will increase, let's say. Now, if you look at this Taylor's model, you will see that it's a synthesis of basically Fisher's effect, in the sense that if the inflation gap is 0, output gap is 0, and if you equate the nominal interest rate to the actual interest rate, and you use expected inflation for the actual inflation here, and then actual interest rate for the equilibrium real interest rate, you will get what we refer to as the Fisher's effect. Now, this Fisher's effect, in the short term, you can express it as follows, where the real interest rate is equal to the nominal interest rate minus expected inflation. Now, when there is increase in the money supply, easy monetary policy, the easy monetary policy will translate into will translate into a decrease in the nominal interest rate. If that happens in the short term, here in this model, we assume that prices are sluggish. So in the short term, they don't move. So in that case, 1-to-1, you will see that when there is increase in the nominal interest rate, it will translate into an increase in the real interest rate. If there is a decrease in nominal interest rate, it will translate into a decrease in the real interest rate. Now, the Taylor rule is being used, but it became, as a policy, became a problem for other countries that do not have, good data to use. So Taylor came out with this principle. And this principle basically is saying that if there is inflation and you really want to reduce inflation, then if there is increase in inflation by, let's say, 5%, you should increase the nominal interest rate by, let's say, 6%, which is more than 5%. If you do that, it will cause the real interest rate to increase. And if the real interest rate increases, then it will bring down that inflation. Now, schematically, you can see it from here. Before this Taylor principle, which emerged from Taylor's rule, before this principle, normally, if there is increase in inflation, which results in increase in real interest rate, monetary policy makers, what they do is they increase the money supply to bring down the inflation rate. Now, but if you increase money supply to bring down the nominal interest rate, to bring down the real interest rate, it causes investment and net exports to increase. And when net exports and investment increases, you tell her, I have more time. You told me I have more time.
I'm just everybody's circle.
Right.
I'll give you some more time.
That's why I'm going at this rate.
Okay.
Okay. So so we have this. There will be increase in real output, and this will cause the increase in real output will cause prices to increase. And as prices increase, you see that inflation will increase. So note, you started from inflation increasing, and you ended up with a monetary policy which exacerbates the inflation increasing further. This we say is destabilizing inflation policy. So in the presence of inflation, central banks cannot increase money supply to bring down interest rate. Because if you do that, it will fuel inflation. Now, what conforms to the principle is that if there is increase in inflation, which causes real interest rate to increase, central banks should reduce the money supply, tight monetary policy. And this tight monetary policy will cause the nominal interest rate to increase. And via the Fisher's effect, which will cause the real interest rate to increase, and that in turn will bring down investment, bring down net export, and then bring down output, prices, and inflation. And note, here, if there is inflation, you can destabilize it, you can stabilize it by using that policy, reducing the money supply. Okay. So this policy became policy that central banks, especially US, and I must say the US Federal Reserve System is basically the leader of central banks. They practically set up policies, and the European Union and the rest of us, all of us follow it. So based on this Taylor rule, we know how to control inflation. Now my proposition is that in our part of the world, inflation does not have, interest rate does not have so much effect on the economy as depreciation or exchange rate. So in our part of the world, if there is increase in inflation, which brings about increase in the real interest rate, if you increase the money supply, which causes the nominal interest rate to fall and real interest rate to fall, the exchange rate will depreciate. If the exchange rate depreciates, it will cause investment to increase, net exports to increase, which will cause real income to increase, and prices will increase, and you will have inflation increasing much further, and that is the destabilizer. Now, for the conforming policy, I'm saying that if there is increase in inflation, which causes real interest rate to increase, and the central bank tighten our monetary policy, that tightening up of the monetary policy will result in interest rate increasing, which will cause real interest rate to increase. And when real interest rate increases, the currency appreciates. And when the currency appreciates, it results in net export decreasing, investment decreasing, output decreasing, prices decreasing, and hence the inflation is brought down. And that this I'm saying that it's an alternate. And as an alternate, I'm saying that for our countries, it is more effective. If you estimate it, it is much more effective than the Taylor's rule. Now note, this is a summary of what I've just said, that if there is increase in inflation, which results in the central bank increasing money supply, which results in depreciation, it will stabilize inflation. Whereas if there is increase in inflation, which results in central bank tightening up monetary policy, and therefore resulting in appreciation of the currency, the prices increase and it stabilizes the inflation. Why am I proposing this? Now, these are among the reasons. We have the following. The reason is that developing countries have highly open economies relative to most developed economies, especially the USA. And they are basically price takers in the world markets, as most of them are producers of raw materials and natural resources. And most importantly, they practically do not have long-term bonds. Okay? And additionally, foreign exchange, unlike T-bills, is not a complicated document. Anybody in the country can go and buy foreign exchange. So I'm saying that market participants do not require any sophisticated document to participate in the foreign exchange markets. Consequently, the foreign exchange market has greater depth and breadth, even for developing countries. In the US too, the same, okay? But in developing countries, we appreciate it much more. Finally, the proposed exchange rate principle is not restricted by problems associated with the zero lower bound. See, during the 2007-2008 financial crisis, which led to Lehman Brothers collapsing, as an attempt to rejuvenate the economy, the central bank, the Federal Reserve System, was caught up in the zero lower bound. This is the same situation that Keynes referred to as the liquidity trap. And since President Obama could not use fiscal policy, which Keynes has designated as the better solution, since he couldn't do it, Janet Yellen was left to use monetary policy. And in an attempt to use the monetary policy, he was following the Taylor's principle. And as a result, he entered into so many problems which led to many people in the Wall Street criticizing him. Okay. So here, based on this, I'm saying that I'm going to estimate a relationship that will find out whether or not the Taylor's rule is effective or whether the Taylor's rule is not effective. Why am I doing this? Yeah, the model I've decided to use is non-linear asymmetric co-integration model. And I have two reasons. The first reason is that Taylor's rule depends on Fisher's effect, and Fisher's effect doesn't do very well in the, it doesn't do very well. It doesn't do very well in empirical studies. So basically, if, for instance, when you estimate it, you don't get good results, basically. So if that is the case, then we need to model it such that it will capture the deficiencies of the Fisher's effect. Okay, so here I decided to use this model. This here, the RT plus, for instance. Okay, let me say PT is price, and price here you decompose it into prices rising, and then PT superscript negative is prices falling. Okay, so when we decompose prices into the case where prices are rising and all of the cases where prices are falling, if we decompose it by using zero, as the threshold value, then it means that whenever prices is increasing, we can say we have inflation. And whenever prices are decreasing, we have deflation. And so this, for instance, here, P plus here will mean deflation, will mean inflation. And then the P minus here will mean deflation, okay? So we do the same thing for interest rate. So the definition here is that the P plus is a partial sum of processes of positive changes, okay? And the P minus is a partial sum of processes of negative changes. Now, if you want references are provided here. The data that I'm going to use are coming from the following, okay? I have the data from Bahamas, Belize, and Jamaica. These are coming from International Standard Organization Country Code Indicators, World Bank. And then the US is coming from FRED, which is St. Louis. Federal Reserve Economic Data from St. Louis. Then I have included Ghana. The Ghana's data is coming from the website of the Central Bank of Ghana. Now, when we estimate it, this is the following. Notice that if there is, for the Bahamas, if there is increase in inflation, this coefficient will tell you, and look at the significance, it will tell you that the interest rate will have to increase far more, okay? Which is consistent with what? The Taylor principle. Now, let's look at Belize. In the interest of time, I'm just looking at one. In the Belize here, even though it's positive, you find that it's not significant, so we cannot rely on that much. However, let's come to Jamaica. Now, when it comes to Jamaica, if there is increase in inflation, and if you follow the Taylor's rule, you'll see that at least the real interest rate also increases, which is also consistent with the Taylor's principle. Okay. Now, anyway, my time is up. I will conclude that. I will conclude that the exchange rate. Let me see. I'll conclude that the exchange rate. The exchange rate. This is appreciation, for instance, USA, right? If there is increase in, if there is an appreciation, which is meaning the exchange rate decreasing, you will see that prices does what? Decreases, and it's highly significant. Okay? Let me bring another one. Let's look at Ghana, for instance. In the case of Ghana, exchange rate, look, highly significant. See? It brings down prices. Let's look at exchange rate. Exchange rate here. Look at Bahamas. It brings down prices, and it's highly significant. Belize, exchange rate. Look at here. It brings down prices. Excuse me. Belize here. It brings down prices, and it's highly significant. Now Jamaica, exchange rate. Bring down prices, and it's highly significant, which is consistent with the Taylor's principle. So my take here is that developing countries should adopt the exchange rate principle. And the reason they should adopt the exchange rate principle is that the exchange rate appreciation is most effective means for central banks to most effective means for central bank for reducing interest rate of the developing countries, as well as USA. And their empirical results are significant, and the coefficients have larger magnitudes relative to results from the real short-term interest rate in all of the countries in the study. Furthermore, apart from that, the exchange rate principle is more effective in achieving the primary monetary policy goal of reducing and stabilizing prices, because it suits the characteristics of developing countries best. And above all, I would say that developing countries do not have long-term interest rate to serve as an intermediate target. Consequently, they do not have long-term interest rate for their central banks to engineer short-term interest rate to influence it effectively to achieve the realized goal of meeting the Taylor's principle. Finally, exchange rate principle is not restricted by the problem associated with the zero lower bound, the situation of liquidity trap, where interest rate is so low that central bank cannot use monetary policy to change. It is not influenced by zero lower bound, so if we use it, it is the best means. Reason, it has wider depth and broader breadth. Thank you.
All right, good afternoon. Thank you so much for coming out. I'm happy to see that so many of you love econometrics. This is absolutely wonderful. So this paper is by myself and two of my co-authors, Daniel Henderson and Christopher Parmeter. The title is a bit misleading because it suggests that we're putting forward a new model, which is not the case here. So we're going to change the title. We're just basically showing you how you can actually, estimate in a very simple way the results of an existing partially parametric model. So that is what this paper is really about. All right. So Robinson in 1988 put forward this a model which we call the partially linear regression model, and it has been used to study a variety of situations. So what the model looks like really, it's you have a response variable, so an outcome, and then you have some x variables, regressors that enter linearly. You also have some regressors that enter nonlinearly through this function here. So m is unknown. And so in other words, it's semi-parametric, and so you have to use smoothing methods in order to estimate it. So, and then the key thing about it is that it's additively separable in these two components. So that, and linear in the x. And so that provides a really cool way of estimating the model, and Robinson showed that. So this model is so popular, it has been used in many different applications in different fields. And this list, of course, is not exhaustive, right? It has been used in education to study marginal returns. It has been used in environmental study to look at the Kuznets curve. It has been used to study consumer demand, all these different things. And as I said before, economic growth too. And so this it's a very popular model in the applied literature. Now, Robinson basically outlined a two-step method and demonstrated the estimation of the parameter vector beta, and he showed that it achieves the parametric rate of convergence, which is root n, and he also was able to attain an estimate of the non-parametric component, and this is estimated at a standard non-parametric rate. So in other words, the model has these really cool asymptotic results, right, and behaves well in finite sample too. So the the attractiveness of this model really comes from the fact that the x's enter in a linear fashion. And so that made Robinson able to basically use a demeaning approach in order to estimate the model. And then after that, you could actually perform ordinary least squares, right? So it's like a two-step approach. So first, you estimate some components using non-parametric methods, and then after that, you can use OLS in order to estimate the rest of it. And so it's pretty useful, and so that is the reason why a lot of people have used it. Okay, but people also have interest in models with nonlinear functional forms. And when I say nonlinear, I mean nonlinear in the x's that I showed you earlier on, right? And some of these applications are also in different fields. For example, Saur in 1988 estimate models that are nonlinear parameters to determine returns to quality and co-authorship in academia. You also have variants of this nonlinear model in first price auction applications, in international trade. Again, you see one in education and in labor market outcomes and so on and so forth, right? So people do have interest in other variants of this model. Now, an issue is that whenever researchers gravitate towards these semi-parametric models that allow for the x to enter nonlinearly, they basically assume that the parametric component is linear in parameters. And so think about when you're doing an empirical application, you want to be guided somewhat by economic theory. And, if economic theory doesn't say exactly what the functional form should be, and you go ahead and you impose like this structure on it, then your results can actually be biased, right? Especially if you're trying to capture, what the theory is predicting. So what we're going to do here is we're taking a model, and this is a generalization of the Robinson's 1988 model. So here again, you have an outcome variable y, and you have this g function here, which is actually known, so it's parametric, and it's a function of x, and the unknown parametric parameter beta that we're going to estimate, and also here you have the, you have the m function that is unknown, right? So remember I said earlier on that the title of the paper is a bit misleading. So it turns out that Robinson in his paper, in his seminal paper, did mention this model, but he mentioned it in passing, like in about 2 lines. He was like, this is another, this is a generalization of the partially linear model, and, in 2 lines, and he suggests like how you could estimate it in like 2 or 3 lines. So there was nothing there to back it up. And then you have Andrews in 1994 and in 1995 in 2 papers in Econometrical, basically showed a way in which you could estimate this model. Well, he provided the theory for estimating this model. There were no simulations in his paper as to how you would actually, how the estimation procedure actually behaves in practice, right? Or in simulated experiments. And also, because of the presence of this non-parametric component, then, and you're going to have to use smoothing methods, then you have to, once you think about smoothing methods, then you have to think about selecting the bandwidth parameter in order to estimate this. So Andrews basically say that, assume that the non-parametric, the bandwidth parameter, basically has a certain, asymptotic behavior, and that was it. So he didn't actually demonstrate, neither did he say how you can actually select that bandwidth parameter, all right? So because of that, people have not really used the model, even though it's a very good alternative to the model, to the partial linear model by Robinson. So what we're going to do in this paper is that we're going to put forward a way in order to estimate this function here. We're going to put forward a way in which we can actually estimate the beta parameter, and we show that that parameter is estimated at the root and consistent rate. And we also show a way how we can estimate this component here, and the bandwidths are actually optimal. All right. What we also do that is different, that is a departure from that strand of the literature, is that we assume that this function, the non-parametric function, may consist of irrelevant variables, like some of the z variables inside the function are irrelevant. In other words, they don't help to explain the variation in y. And why we do that is because in empirical applications, sometimes, you just put in some variables in the model and you're not really sure which ones are relevant and irrelevant and so on. And so we want to try to see how that will actually, how we can actually deal with that, in an applied setting and so on. So we want to make this model as user-friendly and as widely applicable as possible. All right? So that's what I have at this point here. So we accommodate relevant and irrelevant z covariates, and we are going to refer to this model as a partially parametric model. Andrews referred to it as something else, and I don't remember what Robinson referred to it as, even though, right? And what we also do, so we provide asymptotic theory and finite sample results for this model. What we also do, we apply our estimator to an unbalanced panel of 134 countries over the years 1955 to 2011 to estimate a partially constant elasticity of substitution production function with non-parametric control variables. And why this model is actually applicable to this framework is because if you think about what a CES production function looks like, right? It is really highly nonlinear in parameters. Think about a production function with, like, say, capital, physical capital, and, say, human capital, right? Just two inputs. It's highly nonlinear. And so we allow that production. So y would be our production function, and then, the x's would be like, sorry, the z's the x's would be the human capital and physical capital. Are you serious? and the z, with the z's now, because we're not sure about what other variables may affect this production function, then we think about a wide range of possible covariates, and then we just drop them in to see what is going to happen. All right. So, but I won't get to the results here. So let me just some notation. I can do this in 5. All right. So just some notation, not to bore you. So because we allow, another thing is that, we allow the z here not just to consist of relevant and irrelevant regressors, but also continuous and discrete regressors. So we have a mixed regressor setting. And again, the reason why we do that is because we want it to make our model as general as possible and as applicable as possible to different empirical settings. All right. Okay. So let me go quickly. So this is just some notation I'm telling you about, like what we choose as our functional form for the different bandwidths and so on. This is for the discrete regressors. This is a widely known functional form for the bandwidth, and this is a product kernel that we use for continuous regressors. The H here represents the bandwidth for the continuous regressors. The lambda that we see before represents the bandwidth for the discrete regressors, and then the kernel function is basically the product of the continuous one and the discrete one. All right, and we allow for the presence of irrelevant regressors by making this assumption that that y, x, and z bar, where z bar stands for the relevant z covariates, that vector is independent of z tilde, which is the vector for the irrelevant components, right? And lastly, we assume that the true model is this here. So the true parameter, parametric parameter is beta naught. The true non-parametric function consists of only the relevant variables, right? Okay. So, so this is our objective function, and then basically where this m hat here is essentially just a leave-on-out estimator of the non-parametric component. And what I'm going to show you is that what we do, and remember I said that is a simpler way of doing things, right? So what we're able to do using some results that was published in Annals of Statistics in 1993 by Hartley et al., we were able to decompose that objective function into these two separate components. And if you look carefully at it, right, this only depends on beta. This only depends on the bandwidth gamma. And then you have some remainder terms that are either constant or they go to 0, so they don't really matter in optimization. So why am I showing you this is because just think about calculus from first principles when you're minimizing a function, right? If it's separable in the variables that you're trying to minimize, and it's then all you need to do, you can just do one, and then you do the other one. You don't need to do them jointly, right? And so basically that is what we're able to do here. All right, and so where the S tilde beta is this function, I need to change the notation on here of, now that I'm seeing it, to change this notation because we use tilde to represent irrelevant and regressors, and this is not what it means. So this is, I need to change that. So thank you for pointing that out to me. All right, I really appreciate it. Okay, good. And then the T gamma is just this here. All right, and then not to bore you, so these are the asymptotic results. This is a theory where we were able to decompose this into these terms, and then we get these remainder terms that they go to 0. Here's another component. This is the asymptotic distribution for the beta parameter. And this is what this looks weird, but it's just, I mean, if you look closely at it, you realize it looks familiar to you. It's kind of like if you're doing GLS or, you know, weighted least squared, and you have this, your variance covariance matrix would actually have this format here, all right? Okay, and then we show with the gamma component to estimate it, you get these 3 parts here that are bounded, and I didn't put them on the slide because I didn't want to scare you guys away more than I already have so far. So, and then you have a remainder term that goes to 0, all right? So, I know my time is up, but I'm gonna just show you some simulation results, right? 5 more minutes, okay, thank you so much, Chair, I really appreciate it. All right, so some simulation results. These simulation results, however, do not include Z with irrelevant covariates. We're working on that right now, right? So, but these are just, we just assume that the Z's here are relevant. And we look at this model, this general form, and then we also look at this other model, which is linear in parameters. So this is kind of like the Robinson's one. This is more in line with ours, where the X is raised to the power beta, which means that it's nonlinear in variables, right? So, and then we do these Monte Carlos where we choose different sample size and we simulate over 1,000, simulations, sorry, and so on. So the MZ here, we allow the MZ to take all these different functional forms, like about 8 different functional forms, and we try to vary it so that we get a sense of how the method actually behaves in practice, right? If the model is more complicated, will it actually estimate, the M function, the unknown function precisely, all right, or with good precision. So we use, in terms of what we use to determine, like, if the estimator is behaving properly, we use, our metric here is the average squared error. And so we choose average squared error of the parameter beta. We choose average squared error of the estimate of the unknown function, which is the M. And we choose the average squared error of the unknown conditional mean of Y, which is this here. And as you can see from the table, what you want to see here, you want to see these numbers that are, like, well, you want these numbers to actually go to 0 for a given DGP, right? And if you fix any one of these metrics, then you want to see, as n increases, then you want to see this number going to 0. And you do see that going down, all right? So if you choose this one here, which is for the M function, for DGP1, then you notice you see the numbers going to getting smaller, right? And they ought to behave that way if we're saying that our estimator does a good job at estimating what's going on, all right? So basically that's, I'm not showing you the empirical paper because that's, will take up too much time. So in concluding, the Monte Carlo simulation revealed impressive finite sample performance of our single-step estimator. And in the case of the nonlinear parametric function, we show that the estimates of both the parametric and non-parametric components are consistent. And then when we, remember I showed you that there's a DGP in which we look at the linear and parametric function. In that case, we find that many, for many of the cases where we find that our model performs better than the standard 2-stage approach, which is the 2-stage approach is the approach put forward by Robinson in 1998. And if we judge by the current usage of the PLM by applied economists, our simulation suggests that our one-step procedure may have widespread appeal. All right, and so we're in the process of conducting simulations for DGP that accommodate irrelevant covariates in the non-parametric component of the PPM. So we think that we wanted an estimation method that would be as user-friendly as Robinson's estimation method, even though our model is a bit more complicated. All right, and that is what we've done here. Thank you so much for attending. All right.
All right, thank you both for your presentations. Now we open the floor for questions. Either Nadine or questions? No?
That's an indication that we love it.
For everybody, were you suggesting that underdeveloped countries should be using exchange rate targeting rather than inflation targeting? Is that a logical conclusion of your?
I'm talking about instrument. I'm talking about policy instrument, right? That if you want to use, you see, the exchange rate, it's a goal, but it's also an instrument. Now, if your goal is to bring down inflation, then I'm saying that if you use exchange rate, it brings it down more effectively than if you use money supply to bring down interest rate to cause the inflation to come down, right?
So that's just a pure partial analysis with nothing else under consideration but bringing down inflation.
Right, right. And I didn't show you, but on the reverse side, the reverse of it is that the sure way of causing inflation in developing countries is also exchange rate. So whereas appreciation brings down inflation effectively, depreciation also brings up inflation effectively.
So therefore you should be targeting exchange rate.
No. You are using it as an instrument, not as a target. The target, which is the goal, is the inflation. So inflation or deflation, right? Okay.
Anyone else?
So I came in when you were a little advanced in the presentation, so I might have missed something. But it seems like your argument is essentially based on the fact that if you somehow generate an appreciation, cause an appreciation, then it reduces investment, which then, because of that reduction in investment, you have a reduction in prices. But yes, but in the context of, say, Jamaica, and I suspect many of the developing countries, where there is a significant component of demand is imports. I mean, it's not clear to me how your model holds up, because if you have significant imports and you cause an appreciation, then the appreciation tends to drive further imports. But you are suggesting that the appreciation is going to lead to less demand in the domestic market through the investment side. Can you reconcile these for me?
Well, I think that even if you look at Jamaica, you will find that it is very much consistent, that most of the imports and exports, right? Most of our imports and exports depends on the exchange rate. So most of our exports, the exporters, the materials they use depends on the exchange rate. And if and most of our consumer goods, like consumption generally, depends on exchange rate. So if you depreciate the currency, what happens is that depreciation, because that depreciation, excuse me, if you depreciate the currency, that depreciation is going to translate into more expensive imports, because our demand for the imports, here maybe you have to look at the elasticities of the imports, and you will find that they are all inelastic. That it is not a situation where you're saying that, oh, let's depreciate and then we can cut down our imports. It's not a situation like that. So if most of our imports most of our exporters depend on imports, and then most of our importers, which come here, depends on the exchange rate, then I'm saying that in both cases, by way of the materials that go into the production of our goods and services that we export, and the cases of the goods and services that we use in the country, the effect of appreciation tends to the effect of appreciation, meaning that appreciation making it much cheaper, makes the cost cheaper for our manufacturers and our exporters, to the extent that it ends up generating economic growth for the system.
So I think to some extent you might have dodged the question that Peter John asked. It seems to me that it's a reasonable conclusion from your analysis that it might be more effective to target the exchange rate, since exchange rate drives so many other things, than to target inflation, based on your argument, which would, I mean, it opens up a reasonable policy debate, because some countries have elected to target the exchange rates, others have elected to target inflation. But even when you attempted to respond to Peter John, it just appears to me that you are reinforcing Peter John's argument more. So, it seems interesting, and an interesting debate that both of you might have at some point.
But you see, you should make. I should make something clear. That when we target something, then we are making that target a goal that we will use instruments to bring it about. But that is not what I'm saying. I'm saying that the target here is the inflation rate. So, for instance, if Jamaica, if we were to stabilize exchange rate, let's say exchange rate doesn't change, all other things being equal, then, inflation, if we target inflation, let's say if inflation remains the same, it doesn't change. If inflation doesn't change, then you will not experience appreciation, you will not experience depreciation. So that will create a better room for the country to grow, because manufacturers can plan, right? Right. But what I'm saying is not that we are targeting exchange rate. I'm saying that in our desire to bring down or stabilize inflation, the instrument to bring it about, because hitherto the central bank will sell easy monetary policy by selling T-bills, but I'm saying that if you sell T-bills, it's a very sophisticated document that only few institutions in the country can participate in it. Whereas if the central bank is selling exchange rate, that exchange rate, many people can participate in it. here I'm not saying central bank should sell exchange rate, but I'm saying that in the face of inflation, the central bank should undertake policies that will cause the exchange rate to appreciate. In other words, the central bank should sell more currency, right? If the because the central bank has, say, billions of dollars, then they should be in the market, sell when there is increase in demand, and if there is a decrease in demand, sell. But if the central bank is doing that, then it is not targeting. It's not targeting inflation, because if you sell T-bills, it causes. If you sell T-bills, right? Okay, let's say if you buy T-bills, central bank buys T-bills. If the central bank buys T-bills, then what the central bank is doing is it is pumping more money into the system. Right. Okay, so instead of the central bank pumping more money into the system, I'm saying that you should use depreciation. And if you want to if you want to reduce the money supply, then the central bank will be doing what? If you want to reduce money supply, what will the central bank do? Right, right. So in this case, I'm saying that that instrument, T-bills, instead of selling T-bills, they should sell exchange rate. And it's more effective.
I mean, it can be debated as to whether it's more effective. Not because the T-bills are targeted to, or not targeted, but not because the market participants in the T-bill market is a smallest subset of the population.
Right.
Does not necessarily, relative to the exchange rate, the currency market, does not necessarily make it more or less effective.
Yeah,
but you know, in other words, to me, it's an empirical question that probably warrants a little more.
Right. So I produce the empirical result.
Well, this tells me some things, but there are some underlying things that I don't know if the studies have been conducted.
See,
remember, yours is a partial model, so there are some missing things in there.
Right, but
you know, it might be building on knowledge that I am unaware of, so I can't speak clearly on that.
Right.
Good afternoon. I have two questions for Dr. McCloud. Okay. First question, I think you said, and correct me if I'm wrong, that you investigated the case where the linear and the nonlinear components of the model were additively separable?
Yeah, that's the specification. Yeah.
Okay, so I don't know if you guys were planning to investigate the case in which they're not. So that was the first question, if you were going to expand the research to look at that case. And then the second question was to just ask if you could give us a practical example of a situation in which your methodology would be applicable.
Okay, so let me answer the second one first. So the practical example is actually the application in the paper, where we're trying to estimate the elasticity of substitution for this production function, and we're using a CES specification, which by economic theory we all know what the functional form looks like, and is actually highly nonlinear in parameter. It's parametric, we know the functional form, but it's highly nonlinear, and so that is the practical example for this. To your first question, if we were to go ahead and multiply that parametric function by the nonparametric function, then I'm not sure what kind of identification assumption we'll need in order to actually estimate the parameters or even identify them. The fact that it's additively separable is one of the things that makes it easier to deal with. And even if it's not, even if we were to say it's, well, if it's multiplicative, then we could also log both sides, and then that would actually make it additive and maybe that would work. But in terms of what additional assumptions would need, I'm not sure. Yeah. Okay.
Okay, well, we are out of time. I mean, we have 1 minute if there is a burning question.
excellent papers here. Our first presenter is Eric Strobl. Second presenter is going to be Nadia Grant-Reid. Third presenter is going to be Nekeisha Spencer. And our fourth presenter is going to be Rosan Reynolds-Salmon. Okay, so stay tuned. Come on, let's go.
Okay, so thank you very much. So I have to warn you from the start, these aren't my slides. They're of Thomas Tveit's, and I unfortunately decided to travel light with my tablet, and I couldn't install the text editor, so they look a little strange from my point of view, especially because I think he made this presentation for demography audience. But anyway, the title is also marginally changed. So just get into it. So there's lots of papers now that look at the impact of hurricanes. And one particular aspect or economic, semi-economic outcome where there's relatively little literature, at least not very conclusive, is the impact on birth decisions. And arguably that's an important aspect in part because any effect you have on the birth rate can spill over into population dynamics and potentially have sort of a long-term effect that is maybe not easy to tease out. Now, if you look at sort of the literature that has looked at the impact of hurricanes and even large shocks, but particularly with regard to natural disasters, the results tend to be mixed. But there's only about a handful of these. And I think part of the problem is that, particularly when you're talking about modern day studies, is that even if you get relatively good data and you try to estimate it, there's really a lot going on underneath, right? So hurricane warnings are going to make a big difference. People may move, as you can see now, particularly in the last few years. And in the end, you just get this overall net effect that it's not quite sure how much is due to post-disaster management, ex-ante disaster mitigation, these sort of things here. So what we're thinking of when we first started thinking about getting into this project is maybe that we can get some historical data in an historical context where it all be a little bit simpler, in part because there wasn't much ex-ante disaster mitigation or ex-post disaster management, right? And economies were simpler, not meant in a negative way, but they just operated much simpler here. So what we do in this paper is essentially we take historical data for Jamaica using then hurricane track data and try to get a measure, well, an indicator of hurricane destruction, and then try to estimate what the impact is. Now, and this is where this looks a little bit more like a demography presentation from what I understand here. If you look through the literature, a lot of it are essentially papers that focus much more on the demography aspect that tend to deal with hypotheses. So there are four sort of hypotheses that various papers have looked at, either at one or several of them at a time, or essentially these here, and we're going to try to do the same here. One is that hurricanes causes a shift, people to shift births. So the idea behind it is hurricane causes destructions. People decide to have children maybe a little bit later, or maybe there's some premature births, and then they try to have children again here. And so that'd be a temporary increase. The second one is that there might be a permanent reduction in birth rates in terms of that people suddenly, if there's a very large event, they change their expectations about the future, right? Knowing then, well, okay, there might, in the future, there might be a high probability that there's another one, so we're going to change our decisions in terms of fertility, these things. A third one, which is more biologically based, and there was one paper that tried to look at this, is that within sort of biology literature, particularly looking at species, there was some theories around that essentially said if there's, let's say, a low nutritional status, that for a lot of species it might be more advantageous to have more girls than boys, in the sense that female species, in our case female humans, would be less likely to be affected by poor conditions relative to males, right? That is essentially male that was essentially brought up in poor conditions is going to be relatively weak male, and it's going to be not going to be able to compete on the sex market in that regard, right? So people have tried to kind of put this within a human context. And the last one is whether, and that's not really much of a hypothesis, whether the marital status of the mother matters, right? So whether it's single mothers tend to have less births rather than married mothers, in the sense that they're in a much more financially insecure context. Anyway, so looking at these hypotheses one for one before I talk about the data here. So the first one is about whether there's a shift of births, right? And there, essentially what you would expect is that people are kind of postponing their births a little bit, a few months after a hurricane occurs, right? So, and then essentially if you think about it intuitively, what you expect, maybe a fall in births, but then essentially there kind of be a recapture and a little bit of positive effect. They recover fairly quickly and even have a positive effect here. But no real long-term effects beyond this kind of medium-term effect, let's say here. So there, of course, if you look at the literature, there doesn't seem to be much indication in that regard. So there's either tends to be a positive, negative short-term effect or no effect. And that's the sort of mixed effect I was talking about later. Now, hypothesis 2 about a permanent change here. Again, the idea was that people change their expectations once an event occurs. And this remains relatively long here. So is there going to be a permanent change in the birth rate, at least at a very long-term effect, several years lasting in this regard? In the literature, again, you find both these sort of mixed results. Sometimes there was a positive effect, and people have explained to that people are going to try to compensate overall, right? That it might be that they have the idea, particularly this sort of hypothesis that was around for developing countries' households, that they have more births in order to compensate for future negative shocks, right? So in that regard, or there could be negative ones, that they change their expectations. So here one can relate it a little bit to the literature on war and famine. There one found that these long-term effects tend to be negative, whereas particularly one study that looked at storms found actually that households that were affected by storms tend to have more children. And the argument they gave as before is kind of an insurance mechanism, right? But we can't really disentangle what it would be. In terms of the third one, this Trivers-Williard hypothesis, so there the male-female ratio would be affected, so one would expect the female ratio to be higher according to this hypothesis here. There's a little bit support during testing times, and there was a study that looked at during times of unemployment that the birth rate of girls tend to be higher than boys, and they found sort of a significant effect. But then when they tried to look at this for Hurricane Katrina, so hurricane specifically, there was no effect in this regard. And there's some opposite effects looking at other climate events like excess rainfall. So the final one is marital status. So does marital status affect fertility? The idea behind it is that within a stable marital setting, you have maybe two sources of income. So it's a lot less risky to have births here. In the literature, there's very few papers, but there's some support for this here. So that birth rates tend to be particularly affected for single women. Okay, so that's the sort of idea. We wanted to look at these four hypotheses that were around here. Essentially, the data that we really needed for this was historical data. So we looked at Jamaica, in particular because there was birth rate data available. But let me first talk about what we use in terms of population data, because we want to, of course, control for changes in the population. This is probably the dodgiest part in terms of our data input, in the sense that the population data that's available for Jamaica at the parish level, which is what we need, was only available for the years when the census were made here. So essentially what we had to do, given that we're talking about high-frequency birth data, we're using monthly, actually, what we could have done weekly, we have to linearly interpolate, right? And that's always going to be a weakness because we can't take account of migration or even deaths in that regard. So just keep that in the back of mind here. So, and there were large population changes due to immigration. In that period, particularly, it seems, to Cuba, some immigration advances in healthcare. Okay, so the birth date is essentially somebody went back, so in 1888, they introduced legislation that required people to register their births, and it's believed to be relatively exhaustive and was enforced at the time. So essentially we have what is believed close to exhaustive of all births during the period 1901 to 1929. So they digitalized this. Here you have essentially the name, the date, the parish, the gender, and the parent's name. Right? The number of births is about 35,000 per year. So here you can see an entry of the non-digitalized here. For the hurricane, we essentially used historical hurricane tracks that were constructed for that time period. There's some discussion, of course, how exhaustive they are, but for the very big events, big storm events, they're believed to be exhaustive in that regard. So there, essentially, we take these hurricane tracks, we divide Jamaica into its 14 parishes, and for each hurricane, we calculate out the maximum wind speed at the centroid of the parish, because we don't know anything about the population distribution. And we use that as an indicator of sort of the level of destructiveness of the hurricane. In order to get a true damage function from this, and this is where a little bit of, where we get into a little bit dodgy waters, because these damage functions, you never really know what kind of property was there. They have to be estimated. But we essentially use the damage function that's kind of standard used in the literature, where they essentially make the assumption that destruction increases to the cubic rate, and you put some lower and upper threshold. And there's physical reasons for this here. So this is just kind of a graph of what it looks like. Here's the graphs of the data. So we used monthly birth rate data that we constructed over the period. The red lines are indicator of hurricane destruction index. You can see, if you kind of eyeball it with some imagination, it does seem to be a little bit lower when there is high events. But of course, there's a lot of variation here. So the regression is fairly simple. We use the birth rate. We use various specifications here. We essentially put in our hurricane construction index, allowing for lags in some specifications, some climate controls, monthly climate controls, Some parish fixed effects. We also put parish linear trends in there. It didn't really make too much difference here. And then we run a parish fixed effects regression here. So do hurricanes affect births at just that time t when it happens? Here we used various definitions of dependent variable. We always got out it to be negative and significant at the 1% level. This, of course, may not necessarily be that births reduced. It could also be that they reported a month or two later. Who knows in that regard? So here's a picture of the overall coefficients on the lags here. As you can see here, it essentially falls down here. So we can think of this as an estimation of hypothesis 1. Do hurricanes cause people to shift births? But essentially what we see is that birth rates remain negative up until about 16, 17 months. And even though it's not graphed here, they never seem to recover and move into the positive here. So they don't seem to really shift it. It just seems to reduce over a certain time period with a highlight about 12 months later. Right? So is there a permanent effect in birth over the period? So we looked at 3 years, 5 years, 10 years. And what one does find is there's a negative and significant effect up to 10 years later. When you start increasing it to 20 years later, then it starts at least become imprecisely measured or statistically insignificant here. So there seems to be a permanent effect here. Finally, we tried to look at the birth rate for girls versus boys. Right, again, the rate is always relative to how we interpolate that population of these individuals, right, not taking into account immigration over the period. And here, as you can see, just from the graphs, but even when we did a statistical test of differences, they roughly have the same pattern. So that there doesn't seem to be a change in the male-female birth ratio. Finally, we looked at whether the marital status of the mother affected fertility rates. And here, what one clearly finds is that for single mother, now we define single mothers as essentially those when they sign the birth register, they have the choice of putting down the father down. So the ones that where they didn't put down the father, we kind of assume that they were single mothers, right? There's maybe some strength behind that assumption, but certainly we find for those individuals the negative effect is much clearer and is also a little bit larger quantitatively. So there seems to be some support for that. In terms of the overall quantitative effects here, you get on average over a 20-year sample period that there's sort of lost births of about 10,000, marginally more girls than boys, but again, they wasn't significant. Most of these are due to less births for single mothers. This could also be that maybe there's just less single mothers over that period, and some for married mothers. We can see it in terms of the percentage drop over this period. It's 1% roughly over all these different categories. Ideally, we would have liked to then try to simulate some sort of population model and see what long-term impacts have. But for that, we'd need immigration, and death rate data. Yeah. OK, so in summary, we had these 4 hypotheses. We didn't find any evidence of just a temporal displacement, so where it decreased and then increased and recovered. There seemed to be a strong and significant permanent reduction, economically significant in terms of these birth numbers. There was no support for any change in male-female ratio in births, and the effect seems to be mostly driven by single mothers. OK, so thank you.
Okay, good afternoon, everyone. Yes, I also have the habit of walking around while I talk. Maybe it's because I'm a lecturer. Okay, good. All right, so as I just mentioned, I am a lecturer at the Western Jamaica campus in the economics department. And I'm also a PhD student in Salices. So this work that I'm presenting is under construction, and it's going towards my dissertation. So actually like outlets like these because I get constructive criticisms as well as good advice, so I welcome all, okay? All right, so the name of the paper, this is not being projected properly. Oh, it's on, huh? Okay. No, some of it is cut off. Yeah, it's wide width. Okay, I'll just use that one. Okay. All right, so it's called Effect of Vocational Training on Employment and Wage Premium, and I'm using Jamaican data. Now, there's a lot of work done in this area, but my contribution is really using Jamaican data. All right, so what's the theory behind all of this? Well, we all know about the marginal productivity theory. We know that that theory predicts that the more highly trained workers will tend to be employed first. And it also predicts that, well, more skilled workers will get higher wages. All right, now, we know that this prediction is based on the assumption of competitive markets and perfect information. And as a result of that, we know that in Jamaica's case, it might not hold because Jamaica's labor market is riddled with imperfections. And as such, this paper is a pretty good one because at least we get to see what the result will be. All right, so as I mentioned, we'll be looking at the impact of vocational training on employment and wages. Now, in Jamaica, the main institution that provides vocational training is HART, that is Heart Trust NTA. And what I'm going to investigate is how HART training programs are instrumental in improving the labor market outcomes for their trainees. All right, so I'm going to talk a little bit about the Heart Trust NTA. Now, HEART stands for Human Employment and Resource Training Trust. So that is Jamaica's national training agency. And it was established in 1982. And the main idea behind its establishment was for job creation and economic growth. So the government realized that based on where the world was heading, Jamaica would be left behind if they did not educate and train a highly skilled and competitive workforce. All right, so the Heart Trust NTA operates 27 technical and vocational education and training center locations in the island. And that includes 80 community training intervention programs. So basically these training, community training intervention programs involve them going into the underserved communities where young people are most vulnerable, and they will provide training for them in technical and vocational fields. Now I just want to say something quickly. Many times people tend to interchange technical and vocational training, but they are different. Technical training is one in which there is more teaching involved. So there is the science to whatever field is taught, and then of course you do have the practical part of it, but there is more teaching involved. Whereas vocational training focuses on the hands-on part or the practical part of a particular discipline. Another thing too I want to mention is that Heart Trust partners with not only schools like community colleges and high schools, but it also partners with businesses. So they do offer programs to they do offer training to employees of certain businesses, and they also offer their training programs in schools as well. All right, so the offer training options such as hospitality, wellness, beauty services, construction services, automotive services, creative arts, agriculture, ecological sciences, information and communication technology. So they tend to target school leavers as well as employed persons, as I mentioned. All right, so this is just a little data on the enrollment size and certification of trainees in 2017, just to give you an idea of the reach of HEART. In 2017, they, for 49,774 trainees were enrolled in different HEART programs. And they certified 19,989 trainees. So that's quite a number of HEART trainees that's turned out in that year. Okay, so this is just a map of Jamaica that is showing the certification by parish. And if you realize, the majority of certification is focused in St. Andrew, Kingston and St. Andrew, St. Catherine, and Clarendon. And that is because they want to focus their efforts on underserved communities, communities in which young people are volatile communities, in which young people are most vulnerable. So that is why they have so many certifications there. Okay, so that is really in keeping with their mandate to create jobs and also to train young people. Okay, so why am I doing this? Well, the results might provide information that policymakers can use so that they can know what area of education they should focus on. And the results might disprove the marginal productivity theory in the Jamaican context, which can, might be able to be generalized to developing countries. So my research question is, to what extent does the HEART training program improve labor market outcome for HEART trainees? And when I say labor market outcomes, I mean employment and wages. Okay, so the data. I use data from the labor force survey, and they have been collecting data from 1968 up to now. I'll be using 2004 data to 2014, except 2011, and that is because 2011 is a census year, so they said that they do not collect data for this purpose in that year. So the labor force survey has rich data when it comes on to the labor force, has employment data, unemployment data, as well as demographic data. So it was very good to use. So the sample includes 8,100 private dwellings. And the thing about Jamaican labor force survey is that they never retire the respondents. So we get to track them over a long period of time. So the only way that we might not be able to track people is because of attrition, or maybe because of they move out of the area or death, but they never actually retire people. So that's very good. Okay, so my methodology, I use a logistic regression to analyze the effect of training on employment. So my variable of interest is HEART training, as you know, which really is a proxy for vocational training, because as I mentioned to you, HEART not only provides vocational training, but also technical training. However, the majority of their certifications is vocational. So the other variables are sex, education, and age. And the education variable is one that I created because the labor force survey does not have years of schooling. So I had to create that variable by adding up the amount of years that an individual would take to obtain their, let's say, CXCs or degrees. All right, so the employment variable is binary. 1 for employed, 0 for otherwise. The HEART variable also, 1 for receiving HEART training, 0 for not receiving hard training. And as I said, the education variable is years of schooling. All right, so for the other equation, I use Mincer earnings function. And again, the variable of interest is hard training. I use sex, education, and age as my control variables. And in addition to the previous variables, I included experience. Now that experience is really potential experience. I calculated the number of years of potential experience by subtracting the years of schooling from the age of the person, and then I subtract 6. That 6 there is subtracted because it's assumed that most students start attending school at 6. So this is really just a proxy for experience because there was no question that asked about experience, years of experience on the survey. All right, so this is the general logit model, right? I have the independent variables that I mentioned before, and I also use fixed effects in that model. The Hart on wages model, I pretty much just used linear probability regression to model that. And I used real wages, actually the log of real wages, as my income variable. So these are my preliminary results. Okay, so before we talk about the results, I just want to mention that this might not be the methodology that I mentioned, might not, well, I know it's probably not the best methodology, which I'll talk about a little later, and you might see it in the results. Now, for the logit model on Hart on employment, we find that all of the variables were significant, all right? Now, I use the odds ratio as the estimate here. And what we're seeing is that males are less likely to be employed, and persons with more education, older people, and people with hard training are more likely to be employed. Now, and very unexpected result for the Hart on wages model is that the experience had a negative sign as well as education. And I'm assuming that that is probably because I did not account for endogeneity in my model. I should have probably run a 2-stage least squared using instrumental variables, and maybe that would have a control for that. And same for experience squared. That may not make much sense. However, as I said, that this is preliminary, and I intend to use another method, which I'm going to talk about after this. So the results that I received, the result that I obtained were similar to Foster's results when it comes on to age and employment, and Foster used the same model, the logistic model that I used. However, Reese found something different when it came on to employment, and he found what I found when it comes on to hard training, in that hard training increases wages. All right, so as I mentioned, the methodology that I used was not the best one, so I am looking forward to implementing the P-score matching methodology, and that is a method in which a logistic model is run so as to estimate probabilities for those in the control group as well as those in the treatment group, and a match is found, and by so doing, it will eliminate any bias that is inherent in just doing a regular regression. So I hope to do that in the future, and so as to make my results more consistent. All right, so thank you for your time.
See if this works. Okay. All right, good afternoon. I'm Nekeisha Spencer, and I'll be presenting on the impact of decriminalization on marijuana and alcohol consumption. So this is done in conjunction with Eric Strobl. So of course he can't ask me any questions about this paper. But let me go on. So marijuana and marijuana has long been affiliated with Jamaica and Jamaican culture. Now, it has always remained illegal until recently. There was an adjustment to the Dangerous Drug Act of 1948. So on April 15, for the first time, possession of marijuana and cultivation of limited quantities were no longer a criminal offense. And this had benefits, two of which includes relieving pressures on the penal and court system, and it also encouraged development of medical marijuana, of course, legal medical marijuana. However, Jamaica, like other countries that have decriminalized marijuana, they have certain concerns. A major concern is that decriminalization may actually increase marijuana use and, of course, other substances. And a more worrying concern is that it could actually increase health costs, right? So these are things that all countries have on their plate, right? So with that in mind, we decided to explicitly estimate the impact that decriminalization in Jamaica has on marijuana use. I'm sorry. Now, as it relates to the literature, it's very scanty in terms of what has been done before and mixed, right? So we find that some researchers estimated an increase of the impact of decriminalization on marijuana use, and some have found no increase, right? Now, Jamaica in particular is nice for a study like this for a number of different reasons. Now, marijuana has historically played an important role in Jamaica. For example, in the Rastafarian culture, it has been used as, I'm going to say, a source of enlightenment or consciousness. And it has been widely socially accepted in Jamaica. So in the 1970s, for example, between 65 and 75% of the general population, of the rural population consumed marijuana. And today, the lifetime prevalence among the general population is believed to be at 13.5%. And finally, marijuana usage is highest compared to other illicit drugs. So given this background, given this history, of course, it's a nice study to do to see what is happening in Jamaica as a result of changes in the law. So we used data from the National Drug Survey, and this was administered by Jamaica's National Drug Council Association in 2015. And the data collected was very rich. They had a lot of data. From this, we were able to extract different measures of marijuana consumption. So we've had about 5. So the first one is first time respondents were asked if they were smoking marijuana for the first time, whether they smoked marijuana in the past 12 months, number of times they smoked marijuana, the number of spliffs smoked, and the money spent on marijuana. So we took these as our outcome variables for different measures of marijuana consumption. Our main variable of interest was awareness of marijuana legislation. So respondents were asked if they were familiar with the changes made to the Dangerous Drug Act as it relates to marijuana consumption, right? Our control variables, maybe they're too small for you to see, but the survey provided a rich set of controls, and we categorized them into 5 types: attitude, access, knowledge, environmental, and risk variables. So the attitude variables would include respondents' opinion on whether they think marijuana should be used for religious purposes, used by tourists, used for scientific research. And the access variables would include those that respondents were asked if it's easy for them to access marijuana, knowledge, whether they were knowledgeable of the existence of the National Drug Agency or of a drug prevention program. The environmental variables would include those for which the respondents had family members or friends who were using the drug or other types of illicit drugs, and of course that could possibly encourage their use of marijuana. And risk variables would be how the respondents view marijuana in terms of risk level, whether it's high risk or low risk. So we have a rich set of controls, right? We include all of this. So of course, our estimated effect, we believe, is pretty okay in the sense that there are no other factors that could exist possibly that affects marijuana use and is also correlated with awareness of marijuana legislation. And we also included demographics, so education level, marital status, household size, monthly household income. And because we're also trying to see if there are changes in alcohol consumption or alcohol outcome variables extracted from the survey, and we have 4 different measures: first-time drinkers, whether they drank alcohol in the past 12 months, whether they engaged in binge drinking, so if they consume 6 or more drinks on one occasion, and the amount of money spent on alcohol over the past month. So we try to do a comparison between alcohol consumption and marijuana consumption in the end. So this is our model. So we have C, which is marijuana use outcomes, AML, awareness of legislative changes. We have X1, or vector of demographics, X2, which would include all our control variables, access, environmental, knowledge, and risk. And we have our regional dummies and the error term. So, yeah, I believe you can see this. So what we did first is that we estimated the equation with just demographics. So we excluded all those nice control variables that I spoke about. So as you can see, I'm not going to interpret the results right here, but as you can see, awareness of the changes to the Dangerous Drug Act as it relates to marijuana consumption had a positive and significant impact on all our outcome variables, all our measures of consumption for marijuana. We split the sample into 2 according to age, and the main reason for doing this is because since 2015, there's a program in Jamaica called the Step Up program, and it's actually a ganja prevention program, and that program has seen a 54% increase in students enrolled in that program, right? So obviously, this change to the law could possibly have an impact on how youths consume marijuana. All right, so as it relates to the young, ages 12 to 20, we see that it definitely encouraged them smoking marijuana for the first time, and of course, during the past 12 months. For 21 and over, we see that changes to the law increase marijuana consumption across all our measures. Anyway, let's get to the other table where we include all our control variables, all the environmental, risk, attitude, access, and knowledge variables. And what we see for the full sample, we see that awareness of marijuana legislation does not encourage first-time smoking, but we see a significant impact for all the other measures. So, for example, awareness of marijuana legislation increases respondents smoking marijuana in the past 12 months by 2%. We see the frequency increasing by 0.04. We see the number of spliffs increasing by 1.1, and the amount of money spent, we estimate it to be 45 Jamaican dollars. Now, as it relates to the young ages 12 to 20, right, that would be what is listed as Model 2, we see that awareness of marijuana legislation increased consumption among the young by 10%, right? And for the probability of them smoking in the past 12 months, that's 5%, and the number of times smoked is basically 0.9. When it comes to 21 and over, though, we see that let me back up a bit. So we noticed that there is no impact. The money spent on marijuana over the past month for youths is not significant. So we took that to mean that this could be as a result of the income constraints of the young, and probably, if I buy marijuana then and smoke it, then they could share with each other. So maybe that is why we don't see an impact right there. But as for the age 21 and over, we do see positive. We see an increase for the number of times smoked in the past 30 days and the number of spliffs smoked per month. right? Now, this is where things got a little bit interesting, right? So we did this regression again, but this time we're regressing. We're looking at the impact of awareness of the law on alcohol consumption, right? So we noticed that only for the young, ages 12 to 20, we see that awareness of marijuana legislation actually decreased their alcohol consumption, right? So you can see by 519%, right? So that only occurs for the young. So what we took this to mean that awareness of marijuana legislation actually encouraged use to substitute away from alcohol consumption and towards marijuana consumption. So if we compare that big decrease to that increase, right? So this was, of course, an important result, and it seemed to support the evidence that was published in the Gleaner recently about the enrollment of students in the step-up program as, seeing that significant increase, right? So, of course, this is a very important result. It's very, very interesting to me, at least. So, in summary, as we have seen, decriminalizing marijuana has increased consumption in Jamaica, right? The incidence and frequency has significantly increased. But what is worrying is that use among youths has increased, right? So we see a substitution effect going on here, right? But of course, there are certain things that still need to be assessed or would be nice to look at. For example, the implications of marijuana use in terms of an increase in health costs due to potential side effects, that still needs to be assessed. Because remember, I started out by saying that it's a primary concern for countries, including Jamaica, who have that have decriminalized marijuana. So that still needs to be assessed. That would also add volume to the paper. And whether there may be long-term effects on future productivity, of course we don't know, but that is also something that needs to be quantified. And that's it.
Good afternoon, everyone. So the name of this paper is entitled, Does Household Size Matter? And we're going to be looking at the effects of overcrowding in the homes on child development. So most studies that I've read, when they're looking at overcrowding or the effect of stress, they look at adults and the psychological impacts, or they look at rabbits or rats. But you don't find a lot of studies on children and how overcrowding affects children. And if you do find papers on that, they're talking about in the classroom. So I wanted to look at the household to see what is happening at home, how that affecting the development of the child. So children experience increased vulnerability in crowded environments. And as I said before, we're going to be looking at the household. And this is attributed to a few factors. They get little to no attention. There's a lack of privacy and unresponsive parenting skills. There's an absence of comfortable, quiet space, and they're more vulnerable to illnesses and other diseases. Now, as any other child, whatever you learn at home or whatever your environment is at home, you're going to take this out into the world. And so children, negative impacts or whatever impacts we find with overcrowding in the homes, we're expecting them to take on these effects later on into life. So for example, poor performance in school, of course, will later decrease their chance of having higher educational or socioeconomic attainment, and whatever poor interactions that they're having at home, they will also take this out into adulthood, and they're unable to have meaningful relationships with other persons. And so this ultimately leads to what is known as an intergenerational transmission of social inequality. So whatever they're exposed to at home, they have a higher probability of finding themselves in the same situations as their parents. So the aim of the study was to investigate the effect of household crowding across various household sizes on child development, and also to determine whether or not this effect is further impacted by the type of residential facilities. So where did we get our data? The data was derived from the JA Kids database. Now the JA Kids database, it is a longitudinal birth cohort study where we've been following children from birth, all children who were born between July and September 2011. So the study got about 9,800 children. I think that was about 90-something% of the entire population. And parents or mothers in particular, and in some cases fathers, they were asked questions about their socioeconomic background, physical, emotional well-being. And so these children are now, well, they're going to be 8 this year, because it's 2019. So they're going to be 8 this year. So in 2016, we took 1,400 children, and we administered some developmental exercises for them. And the one I'm going to be looking at in particular is called the Griffith's Mental Development Scales. So children were called in, 1,400 of them, and we gave them activities to do, and based on what they did, we're able to score them. And so this particular development scale is broken down into 6 subscales. We look at their locomotive ability, personal and social interaction, language, their eye and hand coordination, mostly looking at the fine motor skills. We look at how they perform in terms of mathematical problems. We look at how they reason. So this was the model used in this paper. So the dependent variable would be the raw score for each developmental subscale. So for each of them, so for example, the locomotive, we tell them that they need to jump. We see how high they can jump, if they can listen to instructions, and they would be scored either 1 point if they actually did what they were supposed to do, and 0 if they didn't do what they were supposed to do. And then we have a row vector of exogenous variables, and these are explanatory factors that are thought to have an influence on each subscale. And so we looked at mother's educational attainment, the father's educational attainment. We looked at employment status of the mothers. We looked at financial aid, if they were actually receiving financial aid. And then we have our error term. So I'm going to look at a little bit more of the independent variables in the next slide. So at first, I wanted to see if the raw scores by themselves, and I only have 2 here because we only found 2 significant social scores that were impacted by overcrowding. So I wanted to see if there was actually any effect of the household size on the raw scores. But after that, when I looked at this, I realized that it doesn't seem to be anything important per se. So what I did was I created an interaction variable to include the household size and the type. One of my reasons for doing this is, I grew up in a very small household, and it was a 2-bedroom, and in that 2-bedroom, my mother and my father, they were in one, and I lived in one with my little brother and my granduncle. And I moved out, moved into a bigger home, and if I were supposed to look at my brother's, how he was grown up in comparison to how I was, I can see a stark difference. Now, I don't want to say it's because of the household size, but I believe that a larger family in a smaller dwelling, the impact of overcrowding may be different. It was actually a small household for that particular, small number of persons for that household. So I'm going to be focusing on the interaction variable. I'm going to be looking at some other variables that I guess stood out a little bit more than I expected them to. So some of the results. Well, the average household size that we found in the sample, we had, 2.9, so approximately 3 persons per household. Now, we divided up the residential structures. We looked at persons who were living in a house by themselves, so they had their own yard. We looked at persons who lived in apartment complexes. We looked at persons who were living in, they probably have somebody who lives at the back of the house as a shared yard. And we also looked at persons who said that they were just sharing a room with somebody. So we had mothers who were just sharing a room, just a single space with somebody else. So based on the preliminary, results, we can see that there's a negative relationship between the household size and the locomotive and the personal development scores. And more importantly, we saw significant differences across the different household types for the locomotive and personal development scores. So I'm going to give an example. So as I said before, we looked at mothers who were living in houses they had their own homes, own property, and compared them to the ones who were living in the single household, just to show the trend. So if they were living in their own homes, what we expected is that the locomotive scores, they would increase. But if it is that we're supposed to move that child and put them into one of the single household, then we're expecting that their scores would decline by 1.03 points. Now, even though the points are very small, right there, when the psychologists are actually giving the parents the results on how your child is developing, that 1 point alone can have a huge difference, because there are different, as I said before, there are different activities that the children are asked to do. So one activity may probably outweigh the other. So they're not equal. So moving a table is basically different than putting down a pen. So they actually, it's one of the drawbacks to the scale itself. They're not equally weighed. A one unit increase in the household size for persons who are living in their own home, we saw a 0.15 point increase in their social development scores. But if we're supposed to move them into the single room household, we saw that it decreased by 0.77. So one of the things is that we don't have any direct mechanism to say, how are we attributing the scores to just say, the size of the household to say that they're having low development scores. So based on studies, what has stood out is that they're saying that what the cause of this is more likely attributed to impaired parent-child relationships. You have more children in the house or more persons, the child does not have the opportunity to basically interact with their parents as they ought to. Now, learning to cope with stress plays an important part in anyone's development, child, adult, or anything. But for children, if it is that they don't have the right or the amount of time to spend with their parents or the supportive relationships, then if it is that their stress system becomes activated in that kind of environment where they don't have the support, then we're expecting them to become more defensive, to react strongly with provocation, or to start to disassociate themselves. And so if they continue, when they grow up like that, we're expecting them, based on what we said before, they would more than likely remain the same. But if it is that they have those relationships at home and the supportive relationships, then those parents are able to buffer that sort of stress and return it to the acceptable levels. So some other findings that we got from the paper or from the results. Now, children of mothers who had no formal education, so these mothers said that they never went to school, we saw that for those children, their performance subscales were decreased by 5 points in compared to mothers who actually said they only went to primary school, so they stopped at primary school. So of course, we didn't find the results saying that as the mothers went on to higher education, the children were performing better. It only really stopped here. Well, it was only significant for this phase. Children of mothers who acquired skills, so we asked persons if they were getting vocational training, like from Heart, for example. We saw that those children, they had 5 points higher in their eye and coordinational skills, so their fine motor development was a little bit higher in comparison to children whose mother stopped at primary school. But what was interesting is that across all the subscales, or most of them, the higher the educational level of the father, the children actually did way better. So just to pull out an example, we compared children whose father stopped at secondary school in comparison to children whose father did not go to school, and their language scores were higher, their fine motor skills were higher, their performance scores were higher, and they were able to reason better than those children whose fathers did not go to school at all. And the same happens with fathers who actually went to get masters, PhD, bachelors. Older mothers in the study tended to have children with low social development scores. One of the reasons could have been that naturally mothers at home are spending time doing the housework, and not, if their house is crowded, for example, they don't have the time to spend with the children. Paternal age really didn't have any significant effect. Boys were scoring higher in the locomotive section than the girls, which was expected because boys tend to be more physically aggressive and impulsive, but the girls were doing better than in all the other subscales. In terms of language, the girls were doing better because, based on studies, girls are able to read nonverbal signs earlier than boys, and boys are often later talkers. And expectedly, children of employed mothers had higher developmental scores than children whose mothers were not employed. So most studies, as I stated before, they're looking at overcrowding, but they're not taking other variables into consideration. So they don't account for socioeconomic variables, so we had to put that in the study. Representative samples, many have argued that they're not representative enough, and so it's hard for us to make generalizations. So in this study, I looked at the effect of housing types on the housing size, just not to look at housing size alone. And we used different child development outcomes instead of saying just there's just one score that we have, we looked at varied numbers, and we looked at socioeconomic variables. And of course, for the birth cohort context, based on what they want to do, we believe that it was a good representative sample. So in concluding, when we look around what is going on, in particular in Kingston, because we have a lot of children who are in Kingston, most of the children were from Kingston, actually, in the study. We see a lot of construction activities going on. So, and most of the times, these construction activities are actually, well, going way over their capacity. So there's limited space for children to actually go out and play. So we have E-Park and we have Hope Zoo, but not a lot of space for children to actually go out and meet other children their age to develop these skills that they need to develop. So one of the suggestions is to have the urban developers and the planners to disregard the policy of exclusionary zoning. So what exclusionary zoning does is that it lowers the number of affordable houses, and so that the land is used for commercial purposes. And what this does, it displaces the poorer families out of the neighborhoods and out of the neighborhoods, and we only have the wealthier middle and upper middle classes staying there. And of course, it's an added disadvantage for the poorer families because they're already limited to access to education, employment opportunities, and anything that can provide any aid in child development. There's also a call for the revamping of Jamaican's rental market because we don't have a lot of affordable rental units. And one suggestion is to provide subsidized housing, so the government will give, well, to low-income earners, assist them with affording housing that is suitable to their family sizes. So when you go to NHT, instead of just getting the 5.5 because you've been paying for so long, it would be nice to also include either the potential family size that you have or what you actually have to see, how you can give a household for that, a particular house for that size. So they should try to develop a standard. It's really difficult because different persons consider privacy or overcrowding it depends on the context. And also for poor persons who live in the rural areas, because of poverty, they're actually forced to live together because it's easier. And also to make the necessary moves to create more affordable houses for that same reason. So, yeah, thank you.
Thank you very much. We're going to take some questions. Any questions?
Hi, so I've got a question for Nadia. So I wanted to know why you used 6 as the year, the year that we start school, or the age that we start school instead of 3.
Yeah, that's what I was going to say, that's standard. That is what is used in the literature. So I just decided to continue the, what's standard.
Okay, and then for Dr. Spencer, okay, so one of the questions from your survey was first time drinking. Is it that you asked, was this their first time drinking? And then why we concluded that, well, if you ask them if it's their first time drinking, why we concluded that the coefficient was a substitution effect?
Well, are you on the same regression using the same control variables? I just changed the dependent variable to be alcohol, the first time drinking. So the model is the same, it's just that the dependent variable was changed, right? So all the controls didn't change, just the outcome variable, right? So that is why I made that comparison.
It's drinking in awareness that marijuana law change.
So I'm looking at the impact of a change in the marijuana legislation on the impact of, looking at the impact of awareness on alcohol consumption. And I did the same thing with the impact of awareness on marijuana consumption, right? So the control variables remain the same. The only difference is that I changed alcohol. I replaced marijuana with alcohol consumption. That's why I made that comparison.
Okay. And did you also consider, because I saw that you only included smoking, why not consider other consumption methods?
Smoking?
Yeah.
Oh, you mean like, I don't understand.
So, yeah, smoking marijuana, why not like edibles or
well, I don't know. The questionnaire
like
didn't ask that question. So what we did is that, yeah, they asked several different questions about that one could use to say this is how they consume marijuana. So I only I think there was one additional one. So the 5 that I mentioned and the other one that is not there was the amount of grams of marijuana bought, but then the data for that was really bad, so I didn't include it. But they didn't ask anything about the consumption of, I don't know, weed cake or whatever they eat.
And then my final question is for Rosan. All right, so I was just curious, is the type of family structure one of your control variables?
No, because they didn't ask. To find out how many persons were living at home, the question was just how many persons do you live with? Or when you go home with the baby, how many persons are in the house? We didn't really ask what type of family you have. We just wanted the numbers.
Because what I was thinking is that might have an effect on how they develop.
Yes, that's true. I can see that.
Hi everyone, great presentation. So I have a quick question for the second and third speaker. So for the second speaker, when you talked about your results for the heart trust, you mentioned that experience and experience square is probably endogenous because that's where you got the negative results, which is counterintuitive. But I also think maybe the heart trust variable itself may be endogenous as well, because one, you have a targeting effect. So heart trust goes out and targets specific people to enter the program, and then you also have the effect that you haven't found a way to actually account for different innate ability, right? So people who go into heart trust program, they all have different abilities, so of course they're going to have different outcomes. So I think you talked about using propensity score matching as a possible alternative for education. I think maybe some kind of differencing technique could also help you as well. If you can create a control group that's very similar to the treatment group. Yeah, it just stood out to me pretty significantly how the heart trust variable may have some problems.
Yes, that is true in that they target school leavers, but the thing about the selection is that most students are underachievers who actually decide to get hard training. When I say underachievers, I mean because their matriculation is really grade 9 level. Yes.
But there's still going to be some heterogeneity in their ability, even if they only...
Yes. Because it's vocational, so some might be, more towards construction or engineering, whatever it is.
Exactly.
Yes. You mentioned difference in difference. It's similar to the P-score, where the P-score is actually better because I would need let's say to find a control group per se, because the methodology, what it does is that it looking at the untreated group versus the treated group, it will use, as I said, assign probabilities to each individual and then match based on how close the probabilities are, and then use those for the control. So it could work in that way.
Okay, I see. And then I had a quick question for the third speaker regarding the marijuana legalization. One thing I found or decriminalization, I should say. One thing I found very interesting was the result that when you looked at alcohol consumption for those 12 to 20, it was negative. That would assume that students are substituting away from, young people substituting away from alcohol towards marijuana. Is that correct? But from what I've seen, a lot of the studies contradict that somewhat because they see it kind of as a complement where you smoke and you drink at the same time. So the substitute is usually cigarettes. So people just move away from smoking cigarettes as moving towards smoking marijuana. So is there a specific reason why you think that it's changed, or do you have any reason why it would be more substitutable in this case versus being a complement in other cases? Illicit?
Teenagers like to get involved in illicit activities.
Okay, but they still can't drink alcohol though. Alcohol is still illegal.
It's illicit, and barrier is that result is not unique. I mean, others have.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah.
I was just going to say the same thing that Ghartey said. That yes, some people have found the complements, but I have backup saying that there's a substitution effect going on right there. And then this legislation is the change is kind of new, and maybe just get excited because the step-up program was implemented not long after the legislation was adjusted, and they saw a significant increase in the number of students enrolled in the program. So they probably just get overexcited, and that's why we see this significant movement away from alcohol towards marijuana, I guess. No, you don't agree?
You can still have marijuana being a substitute for cigarette, while marijuana is also so yeah, that's fine.
So there were studies based
Okay. Yeah, this is for Nekeisha. I might have zoned out and missed this, but I'll ask it anyway since I didn't hear the question, the answer. Isn't it, so in the survey, people were asked about their marijuana usage and other things, and then they were asked if they were aware of the law change. Isn't it possible that people who use marijuana are just more aware of marijuana laws? So there's kind of a reverse causality there? I mean, so I don't use marijuana, and I actually, so.
Yeah.
So the control, the user control the other day smoked it before. Oh.
So you do use that?
No, we put it in a control specifically for that, for the use that before.
Right. So you do have controls on past. Sorry. So you could actually, yeah. Okay. That was my next question: is do you know what their drug usage was prior to the law change?
Well, I mean, there was a question also about whether they smoke other things, tobacco or.
But you don't know, like a year ago, did you smoke marijuana?
A year ago?
Or something like prior to the law change. That's what I was thinking, where you could control for the fact that.
I have to think, there are so many controls in there. I don't remember, but I could check back.
It's a repeated cross section, right? So you don't have a panel structure.
No, it's not a panel. No.
Right. That's something to think about. I wonder if there's a way to interact that variable with other things to see if.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know, I'm just, anecdotes are dangerous, but I'm just guessing somebody who's a regular user is paying more attention to laws than people who aren't, but I don't know.
But I mean, I guess that could be true, but then because it's so ingrained in the society
there's this
already.
other question is who doesn't know there was a major change in the law, right? Who are those people? They're probably people who aren't users, is that right? I mean, that's what I would think.
Maybe, yeah, I would think so. Because, I mean, people use it anyway. Although it has remained illegal, people just
anyway,
use
it's just something to think about. Thanks.
So probably not.
I have a question for Eric. So in terms of measuring fertility, did you look at, for example, first births or completed fertility? How exactly did you define it?
I mean, the problem is the data. Essentially, they have this birth register where all you have is the date of birth, whether it's male, female, the name of the mother and father, if it was listed. So we couldn't look into any of those things, unfortunately.
And
It was very difficult to match names. I mean, we tried a little bit, but it just was not possible. We found essentially no names matched, just because they were spelled differently, which didn't make any sense. You know.
Okay, and was there any changes in the distribution of the women giving births?
In the distribution, in the sense of?
Based on observables, perhaps, I don't know
Well, we
what
don't have any
variables
observables.
were available in the data set because it's historical data.
I mean, there was only in the sense of the census, but the census was every 10 years. So you found that the population got a little bit older of women, not surprisingly because increased health system and health care. But it's only every 10 years, so we couldn't have linked it even to yearly data if we wanted to.
So what exactly was the interpolation?
I mean, we tried linear interpolation, nonlinear interpolation. It didn't really matter at the base category because we're using monthly data, so it just didn't matter. All our results
what was the purpose? Was it to interpolate the number of births that would be given in the years in which the census wasn't conducted?
I'm not sure what your question is. So essentially the birth data would essentially be daily, if you believe dates there. And we just wanted to control for population changes over that period, right?
Okay.
Maybe you guys can talk over
Yes.
marijuana, maybe?
Yes. All right, thank you.
So I have a question for Rosan. From your descriptive statistics, I saw that the average household size was 2.9, right? So roughly 3 persons per household. So that seems normal to me. As it relates to, I don't know what the extreme value was. What's the maximum that you had in the survey?
Went up to 12.
To 12.
Yeah.
And so my question was that it seemed like the average household did not have overcrowding. And I don't know if you guys had defined what overcrowding was. And if so, okay, you can go answer it.
So what I've seen is if there is a standard for overcrowding, I have seen 2, and sometimes the value has gone up to 3 in some cases, but I think it depends on country. Yeah, it depends on where it is. And different persons have a different interpretation for overcrowding. So
for your work, what did you guys, when you guys were saying overcrowding, what were you thinking about?
In terms of what I wanted to actually find is basically if the number of persons living in the household was affecting the residential capacity. And also because we only took 1,400 of the children, we left out, 7,000 persons out of it. And most of the children that we actually found, for the 1,400, they came probably from Kingston, because when we were trying to contact the parents, they couldn't get the rural areas. We couldn't contact those persons. We couldn't get them to change numbers or something. So most of the persons were from Kingston, and we had some persons outside. But Kingston, most of the homes that we also, for the Kingston families, most persons were living in their own homes. We had a few persons, well, not a few persons actually living in duplexes, and we had a little bit more persons living in shared yards, and quite a lot of persons saying that they live in a single room. They're living in a single room with somebody else.
So one thing I was thinking was that if you guys could find somewhat as to a rough idea as to what you guys call overcrowding and create some indicator variable as to whether or not a child.
I think that would be something that we'd probably have to try to create, because we'd have to take into consideration our culture.
Yes.
Right. So I think it is something we'd actually have to try to create instead of
find.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. And then what I was thinking is that a lot of the variable, the results that you were looking at, I would be interested to see how does that differ depending on whether or not the child was living in a overcrowded household or not. And so like you talk about the father's education status. And we saw some impact coming from the mother's side. So I was wondering, how does this differ as to whether or not the child actually lives in a overcrowded household? So that would be interesting to do some to actually do some interactions and get more out of what you have. But I like your research.
Just a quick follow-up to Patrice's point. So I was also wondering about the overcrowding variable as well. Do you have any data on how the characteristic of their house?
The only thing that we asked them was, are you living in a shared yard, duplex, you have your own home, or you live in an apartment? That was the only question that we asked. I think the only thing closer to that would have been, in terms of financial, are you renting? But that variable, I think we had some problems with it because of how it was worded, and we had some weird responses in some weird selections. We had values coming up that were not a part of the data set, so we really actually excluded the variable.
Okay, because I think definitely that point that Patrice made, it matters a lot, that you do need some kind of variable. It could be with a binary or some way to determine what you mean by overcrowding, because I definitely thought about that as an issue.
Right, so in the context of our research, the term overcrowding is actually loosely defined, right, which is the point I think both of you guys are. All right, so in fact what she's really looking at is whether or not household size influences certain outcomes. So it's not necessarily overcrowding as you would actually want it to be defined. All right, so but that's actually a good point in terms of if you could actually get a good measure of what specifically is overcrowding, then it could actually improve the results.
Yeah, it's like number of child per square feet or something like that.
Yes.
So this is Nekeisha. So you're finding that looking at the 12 to 20 year age group, that there is an increase in first-time usage of marijuana, and for the same group, a reduction in first-time use of alcohol. And so the question that you raised was, to what extent, or at least I am thinking, to what extent should I be worried that there is substitution away from alcohol to marijuana? And I think a lot of that depends on your views on the implications of marijuana use for health, or the impact that it has on one's health relative to the impact of alcohol. So should I think of this as positive, so that people are consuming something that is that we already know to be potentially bad for health, to something that there might still be some ambiguity about the impacts of the, or should I be like, this is worse because there might be questions about the extent to which marijuana use affects mental development, especially for children at a certain age group and so on. So I think that's like an important policy question related to your work is, should I be worried or should I be like celebrating?
I don't know. Well, based on what is out there in terms of increase in marijuana consumption having an impact on the healthcare costs, I would think that this is more of a worry. One of the questions that the survey asks is whether people think that it should be used for medical marijuana. So that would be, when people use it in large quantities, it's usually for medical research. So I guess if kids are consuming it, then maybe that is why I think it should be worrying, because they wouldn't be using it within the constraints that, because if they, for example, Melanie was asking something about a cake or some other type of marijuana product, but if they probably overconsume it, then probably it would be a problem. I don't know. I guess I could look into that, but I'm really not sure.
Yeah, but it doesn't, could be totally value neutral. We simply want to know, are people consuming more or less in response to something? Now, what value we put on that is another question, and that may be a question not for you to answer.
Right.
That may be a question for the medical community to deal with, but you can supply them with the answers that people are using more or less.
Yeah,
the thing is that before you answer, with the step-up program, though, that was implemented in 2015. I think it's probably because of this change in legislation. So that is going to add an additional cost for the health sector, having this program to rehabilitate kids who are smoking too much joints. I don't know. So that's actually a problem.
Yeah, but I think what I'm saying is, it's not just so much children are consuming weed, and there is a bad kind of outcome associated with that, is in your finding is that they're also consuming less alcohol.
Oh, that's
so the
happy
question
part.
is, on net, should I be worried or should I celebrate? That's the question, right?
Oh,
so
okay.
I know that it might not be for her, it might not be for you to answer,
Yes.
but it's like the next step, right? It's you're finding a substitution,
Yeah.
and the question is, on net, should the country be worried or should it be like, yeah, so we're giving up one bad and we're getting another one, but on net it might be an improvement. On net it might be a worsening of situation. So that's kind of where I was going.
That's fine.
Okay, any more questions? Okay, I have one. You have one now?
I was just curious as to the age grouping, why we use 12 to 20 and not perhaps 12 to 17, that we could like take you to the underage.
Well, I think, I thought about that too when I was doing the presentation. I think, I found some papers that actually did it that way. And then because of alcohol consumption, I think isn't the legal age like 21 or plus? I guess in order to do the comparison then. Huh? I don't know. I really don't. So I guess for the alcohol consumption, marijuana comparison, that's why it was fit like that.
Mel, I hope you're not telling us something that you should be telling us, but this is interesting. I'm learning more and more about you each day. Okay, all right. Okay, I have one question. Any more questions from? Okay, good. One question for next. In that regression where the variable was money spent, and I noticed for the full sample it was positive, it's significant, and then for the subsamples it was insignificant. For both age groups. So I was wondering, usually if you see positive and significant, then and based on how you do your subsampling, then you'll probably see some kind of significance for the other samples. So I was wondering, why is that the case? Why is it that it would be positive and significant for the full sample, but when you do, because I was thinking, okay, maybe there's some kind of heterogeneity that but I didn't see anything at all. It was just insignificant. So I was wondering if maybe you could try other groupings, different, yes, and to see, what is happening. You see what I mean? Yeah.
Before we added all the controls, though, the positive. Well, I'll look into that. But before we added the controls, though, all those risk environmental variables, it still remain positive and significant for the adult grouping, or what I would call the adult grouping.
So now the full sample is everybody.
Yes, but so before I added the control variables, the different risk and environmental variables, the money spent was positive and significant for the 21 and over.
Okay. All right. I guess I'll look back at the table to see, because I was looking at one particular table, not before. And
Okay.
afterwards, and so I noticed, you had 3 columns, full sample.
Yeah.
With, 12 to 20, 12 to what?
20 and 21 and over.
Right, yeah, and I saw significance and then insignificance for the other 2 columns. So that is.
That was in the second table. The first table had positive and significant, though. It remained positive and significant.
So what was the first table?
The first table was with the demographics only and the regional dummies. And the second table was with every single control, all the different categories of control.
Okay, but it's still subsamples. Yeah. Okay.
Were there any gender differences since females smoke more than?
I did that initially. No, yes, I did do that. Initially, when before I started submitting to journals, I did do that, but I honestly don't remember what it was. Or probably males were the ones that were smoking.
I
don't remember exactly what the results were. I think they were not too good, so I probably just didn't bother with them.
So just to follow up on the question that Professor Woolridge asked, because I had the same comment, and I also had a follow-up comment on that asking about the variation in awareness across the within the sample. And I'm trying to think of, is there a way to solve this? And so the question is there any significant variation in marijuana usage across parishes. I have a bias in my mind that if you go west, it's just abuse smokers and stuff. But
I don't
that
know.
might
I
just
didn't
be
look at. I didn't look at that though. I didn't know.
Because the reason I ask is if you have enough variation across parishes in prior usage, I wonder if that is one way to kind of try to address the concern that all of what you're finding is just reverse causality. It's that those who smoke a lot of weed are more tuned to what's happening to the legislation surrounding weed, and I don't know to what extent if that variation exists. If it would help in any way to solve this problem.
Thank you so much for coming out. So let's give our presenters a big round of applause. Enjoy the rest of your evening, and we'll see you guys tomorrow morning bright and early, okay?